everyone. I am so excited to see so many of you here. This is wonderful. My name is Melissa Brown, for those that I have not met yet, but I see a lot of faces that I do know. And I am so excited to be here actually to talk to you about the context and the music in this wonderful symphony. Okay. There's a little blurb about me in your program notes if you have your programs yet. But basically, I spent my undergraduate and graduate years studying Romance languages and literature. And some of that time actually took place in Madrid. And I literally finished with a concentration in the work of Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote. So, yeah, I'm kind of a relic myself. I always joke about this. Okay, I studied. So anyway, you all have notes about me. That's just a little bit about who I am and what my background was. I'm kind of a relic myself. I always joke about this. But I was really thrilled that a year and a half ago, when this was chosen as the symphonic work for today's concert, that I was able to immediately offer a pre-concert talk, which will hopefully present some relevant information for you to take into the concert hall as you listen. So, that's what we're going to do. Just a little bit about the composer and this piece itself. Don Quixote is the third full symphony written by Robert W. Smith. Okay, he's an American composer, born in 1958, so he is living, composing, and teaching, and is now the coordinator of the music industry program at Troy State University in his native Alabama. His compositions for concert band are extensive. There are about 700 pieces that he has written and published for concert band. Any Troy State alumni here? Jeff, actually, from Troy, awesome, Troy State. So Robert Smith's first symphony for concert band was written based on Dante's Divine Comedy, and the second one was written based on Homer's Odyssey. So he had read both of these works and had an affinity for writing music based on epic literature. And finally, he wrote this third symphony based on the masterpiece by Cervantes, and these are the movements that we're going to explore here together. The maestro and I actually had a Zoom call with the composer a couple of weeks ago, and he told us that the concert band in Denia, Spain, commissioned this to be written on Spanish soil for the 400th anniversary of the publication of Don Quixote. So he went there to Spain and worked for a couple of months. Denia is on the southeastern coast of Spain. It's a small city on the map, and it's south of Valencia and Alicante. So if you've heard of those bigger cities, that's kind of where it is on the coast. And it's the port city where Cervantes, the author, landed following his imprisonment in Algiers. It's also about an hour away from La Mancha, which is where the story of Don Quixote takes place. And this is really cool. When the composer told us this, the string bass player in the Spanish band in Denia is a member of the same family that still owns the inn in La Mancha where Don Quixote supposedly had some encounters in the novel. So there are all kinds of really neat links between this book and this particular composition. So why write a symphonic work about Don Quixote at all? Okay, it's a novel that was written and completed over 400 years ago. Cervantes was a contemporary of William Shakespeare. In fact, they lived at the same time, and it's really speculated that they died within the same week of each other. So, in the early 1600s, we're talking about a couple of dead white guys here. Why are we still talking about them at all? What makes this story so captivating that it's worth commemorating in a piece of symphonic music even now? I just have a few quotes to share about the author Cervantes and his creation, Don Quixote, just to kind of put it in the context of the canon of world literature, Western literature in particular. 20th century Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov said, "Don Quixote is greater today than he was in Cervantes' womb. He looms so wonderfully above the skyline of literature that the book lives and will live through his sheer vitality. He stands for everything that is gentle, forlorn, pure, unselfish, and gallant. The parody has become a paragon." Czech writer Milan Kundera, I hope I'm pronouncing that right in Czech, said, "Don Quixote is practically unthinkable as a living being, And yet, in our memory, what character is more alive? Cervantes is the founder of the modern era. The novelists need answer to no one but him. Mexican author Carlos Fuentes, who's one of my favorites when I was studying literature in Spanish, he said, when I was a young student in Latin American schools, we were constantly being asked to define the boundary between the Middle Ages and the modern age. For me, the modern world begins when Don Quixote de la Mancha in 1605 leaves his village, goes out into the world, and discovers that the world does not resemble what he has read about it. And finally, G.K. Chesterton wrote, the point where the modern world broke away from this last medievalism, that symbolic act and moment was Don Quixote. I want to ask whether if Don Quixote returned today with the same wild ways of knight-errantry, it would not rather be the knight-errant that was sensible and the world all around him that was crazy. The rational world has turned out much more irrational. And Chesterton wrote that in 1912. This was over 100 years ago. So we're going to dive into each of the four movements of this symphony. Movement 1 is the quest. Movement 2 is Dulcinea. I love saying that. Movement 3 is Sancho and the Windmills. And movement 4 is the Illumination. And as we do that, I'm going to share a little bit about the literary context, and we'll explore how Smith uses the sound and instrumentation to illustrate the story and communicate the meaning. Let me just take a break. So movement 1 is the quest. Okay. The first movement of the symphony is just taken from the beginning of the story, really. At the very opening of the novel, we're told that a Spanish hidalgo, which is a title of lesser or lower nobility, of ambiguous name and lineage, he's around 50 years old and retired, takes to spending all of his leisure time reading the books and legends of medieval chivalry, which were the popular literature at the time. We find out early that his name is most likely Quijano, but again, the author Cervantes leaves his identity open-ended. So what's important that we know about him is that he becomes obsessed with reading these books of chivalry. And it becomes a fixation to the point that he sells off his land and basically uses his retirement funds to purchase the books and increase his library. So some people today, especially in today's understanding of mental illness, liken this to something like early onset dementia or something akin to Alzheimer's, that this gentleman had. But a lot of academics have likened it to the idea of a midlife crisis, which we're all familiar with. I would agree. We've all known somebody that's kind of been in that. And I would agree more with that because there's a strong element of the will to his undertaking. Okay, he doesn't just lose his mind aimlessly. He loses his mind with a definite purpose. And there's the difference there. Okay. He reads so much that he starts to believe that what he's reading in these stories is absolutely true. He finally determines to set out himself as a knight-errant. And the difference between a knight-errant and knights, other types of knights, were that a knight-errant is an independent knight in search of adventure rather than joining up to serve a particular kingdom or army. So he kind of is an independent freelancer, if you will, and goes out and does it like in that regard. And he determines to defend the weak and right all manner of wrongs in society according to his own personal truth. And he's determining to make his life mirror this beloved literature of his. Okay, he uses the books of chivalry as a guide to designing a new life for himself. And what's interesting about all of this is that we know very little about his life up to that point. It probably doesn't matter enough to the author to let readers in on it. But either way, it's so inconsequential that the details of his life are not worth mentioning. But he uses the books of chivalry as direction and sets out to create a new identity for himself. He calls himself Don Quixote de la Mancha, which is a lofty play on his surname, Quijano, and a nod to his homeland, La Mancha, which is the desert plains region of Castile. He gets some old armor that had belonged to someone in his family in the past, one of his ancestors, and an old hack horse to be his steed, and he sets out. Okay, so imagine this hilarious picture. The official title of the novel is actually The Ingenious Gentleman, Don Quixote of La Mancha, which is also interesting in light of the idea of the quest, which is this first movement of the symphony. The quest itself is an ingenious mission to make his life mirror the accounts of knights in the age of chivalry, as well as a way to make his own life valuable and memorable. However, okay, this is a big but. We have to remember that all of this is a consequence of his first having lost his mind, okay? So the madness is both the conduit and the drawback to his newfound self-expression. And I hope I'm making this clear to people to understand. So the quest is simultaneously misguided, but still noble in its idealism, okay? So let's dive into some of the ways that the composer illustrates this musically in the first movement. So the composer tells us he's used the euphonium, which is a low brass instrument, as a musical metaphor for the character throughout the symphony. But he contrasts it with the sound of dissonant metallic percussion, the chimes and the glockenspiel, to symbolize the Don's loss of mental capacity, okay? At the introduction of the piece, we hear the tubular bells, which signal the precarious mental state of the main character, okay? And they're gonna sound off. They're gonna sound like clangs in the middle of the piece, and that's, you know, it'll be prominent throughout the symphony. You'll be able to hear it. And we have our tubular bell player right there. From the initial solo euphonium, the music opens up into a grander sound as the quest takes shape. And the euphonium continues characterizing the getting ready stage of the main character. So he's getting ready to kind of launch out into the world. The castanets switch from 3/4 time to 4/4 time, which simulates the sound of a horse's hooves. And the way the composer intertwines major and minor keys and the specific rhythms and the castanets and those instruments gives us the impression of Spanish culture and folklore. So as you're listening to it, you're going to feel like you're in the Spanish plains. The brass represents heraldry and fanfare. There's a lot of that in this movement too. And we're also, in the middle of this movement, introduced to the insertion of a passage that sounds like medieval countryside music. It was reminding me of some music that was used perhaps in movies about Robin Hood and Maid Marian. So listen to that, because it's, you know, that characterizes some of this piece too. And it reminds the listener that the quest is born out of the legends and traditions of chivalry, centuries before the author of this story, harking back to the quests of the past. So see if you can identify that softer musical nod to medievalism in the flute especially, as you're listening. After that, we have more brass and castanet percussion, lots of dissonance again, especially in the metallics. And we connect back to the symphonic grandiosity, and off we go. So that's movement 1. Okay. And the second movement is Dulcinea. The title of this movement is the name of Don Quixote's lady. And if your experience with this story is the original play Man of La Mancha, as was the case with my first exposure to this story, I just invite you to forget or suspend temporarily what you think you know. Because just as an aside, Man of La Mancha is a beautiful story, but it's an original inspired by some episodes in the novel and other slices of Cervantes' life. It's not the story, as it were. So back to the 17th century story. When Don Quixote sets out to become a knight, in the tradition of the knights of legend, he believes he needs a lady to inspire him, to dedicate his brave deeds to call upon and defeat, etc. He believes that the code of chivalry requires this because all the knights of old not only took up brave exploits, but were reputed to be great lovers as well. So Don Quixote's favorite medieval knights were Amadis of Gaul and Roland, Charlemagne's nephew. In Spanish and Italian, that's Orlando. And those are knights that are mentioned over and over in the book. So for his quest, he needs a lady. Now, just as a background, the courtly love tradition comes from medieval times. A knight might serve his lady, but most often this relationship would be kind of like a platonic love, due to the fact that the lady was of higher rank, usually married to someone else. Courtly love was an idealization and based on service. It was not a relationship that actually led to life partnership. And the main characteristic of it was that the beloved was unattainable. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind, just a little background on where this comes from. It was not a daily, concrete form of love. Many knights and poets of old would pine for their ladies in sonnets, for example, but never actually come to be with them. So that was the nature of it. So back to Don Quixote, he thinks of a peasant woman from the next town whom he had seen a few times over the course of his life, but never actually met. She's attractive but earthy. Her name is Aldonza Lorenzo, but this name doesn't sound high-flown enough for his aspirations of knighthood and glory. And of course, in the books of chivalry, all of these ladies had high-flown names. So he decides to call her Dulcinea del Toboso. Dulcinea comes from the Spanish word dulce, which means sweet. So, sweet lady of El Toboso. But as his imagination spirals, again, because we have that theme going on, Dulcinea becomes a fantasy in his mind, completely separate from Aldonza at all. In the novel, Sancho describes Aldonza as a sturdy country lass, while the fantasy of Dulcinea is described by Don Quixote as a great beauty with all of the attributes of the ladies in medieval poetry. Cervantes continues to set up this duality in the novel between the real and the ideal. And I didn't do visual slides for copyright reasons for this talk, but paintings and sculptures of her over the centuries convey both of these aspects and everything in between. So she is literally a fantastical spectrum. Okay. And the whole time we're remembering that Don Quixote is mentally unstable. So Dulcinea is an unrequited love because she's a creation and totally remote from any real concrete woman in his life. She is the unseen, ever-present driving force behind all of Don Quixote's acts of chivalry. And he is completely and sincerely devoted to her, someone who he's never seen but always imagines in his mind's eye. Okay. So the composer, Robert W. Smith, said this movement speaks to his heart and says he finds it more beautiful over the years that it's performed than when he first wrote it. There's clearly admiration for the Don here. Just like the quest overall, his love of Dulcinea is simultaneously misguided but noble. So let's take a look at some of the ways the composer illustrates this in the music. Okay, the goal here is to create a dream state with various contradicting solo instruments to create confusion. Okay, he starts off briefly with the flutes and the leitmotif of the medieval early music that we heard in the first movement. And the flute, according to the composer, is the voice of the lady Dulcinea. The cor anglais, or the English horn, is a woodwind instrument. It's similar to the oboe, but it's lower in pitch. And that takes over as the solo. And this instrument has been used to represent nostalgia and longing. So that's really kind of the idea of using the English horn there. Again, it's contrasted with the dissonant chimes and percussion, which again remind us that Don Quixote has lost his mind. So again, listen for that. Now this part was completely fascinating to me, and I didn't realize it until I had listened to the symphony a few times. The time signature is in 5/4, so it's not a waltz in 3/4 or a tango time of 4/4, but it's a dance that can't be undertaken. If you're listening to it, it sounds wrong or off a little bit, okay? Later on, the castanets and the melody are playing a bolero, and the string bass and the accompaniment are playing a tango at the same time, neither of which is in the right time signature. Okay, so talk about the Don's state of mental confusion. This is what's going on. But I'm telling you, the music is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Then there's a crescendo to majestic full band. The composer reiterates that the direction to the band is con pasión, with passion, to play with passion. And despite the misguided intentions, we still recognize Don Quixote's devotion and commitment to his ideal. Okay? The cor anglais, the English horn, comes back and trails off, and we hear one last dissonant percussive clang from the vibraphone. So that's this movement, and it's really amazing. Yeah. Sorry for all the water. That gets dry when I'm speaking. So now we move to movement 3, Sancho and the Windmills. As Don Quixote goes out in search of adventure, he recruits a local neighbor of his, Sancho Panza, to be his squire. Okay, again, this goes back to the medieval days of chivalry, when a knight would have a squire or a page boy to serve as an attendant. They would carry their shield. They would do simple but important tasks like saddling their horse or caring for the knight's weapons and armor. The squire would sometimes carry the knight's flag into battle with his master. And usually the squire was a young knight in training. So the idea is of an apprentice in chivalry, basically. Enter Sancho Panza, okay? He's a short, rotund, married man with a family who has practical reasons for getting involved with Don Quixote's adventures. Once Don Quixote explains that a squire could be rewarded in tangible ways, like becoming governor of a piece of land that the knight conquers, for example, and sharing in the spoils, then he's all in. So this is the character we're dealing with in him. He's famous for his appetite, his common sense, vulgar wit, and quoting lots of proverbs. And at times he has to protect Don Quixote from the world's influences and attacks, and other times he tricks him in order to protect him. So this is the character that's set up. Sancho is the realistic counterpart to the idealism of Don Quixote. One of the elements that characterizes the emergent modern novel here is the dialogue that the author sets up between the two of them. Okay? We know that humans don't exist in isolation. We need each other, and we need various perspectives in order to learn and grow. And as their relationship grows through their adventures, or better, misadventures together, scholars say there is a gradual welding of the 2 points of view. And actually, in my studies, it was known as the Sanctification of Don Quixote and the Quixotization of Sancho. So that's what we used to call it. One of the famous battle scenes in the story is the episode where Don Quixote charges at the windmills on the plains of La Mancha. Okay? Anyone who knows this story in even the remotest terms is familiar with the windmill scene, right? In English, we get the phrase tilting at windmills to describe any action that is idealistic, impossible, or even doomed to failure. And in the discussion of the first movement, I mentioned that La Mancha is the flat, dry plains region of Castile, which is the desert part of today's concert title, by the way. In La Mancha, they're famous for their wine and cheese. If you've ever had queso manchego, that's where it comes from. Yeah, that is La Mancha cheese. And the region is dotted with windmills, so it's part of their everyday agricultural life. Don Quixote sees the windmills with the great arms as giants that he must fight and vanquish, because again, he's seeing everything through the lens of the books of chivalry. Sancho, as his squire, rides behind him and picks him off the ground as his delusions collide with harsh reality. And this is interesting too, it's just an aside from the novel, but when Sancho tells him that they're windmills, not giants, Don Quixote's absolute truth kicks in again. He rationalizes that he has an unseen enemy, a great enchanter who is changing the shape of the giants into windmills at the last minute to prevent his victory and discredit him. So this is again what we're dealing with, okay? Sancho is both spectator and participant in this whole situation. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how the composer illustrates this relationship and their farcical interaction with the windmill. So I want to add that traditionally in symphonic works, the third movement of a symphony with 4 movements would be known as a scherzo. A lot of times that's the case. Scherzo in Italian means a joke or a farce. Okay, so This movement is really going to be the one that provides some comic relief, especially in the percussion section, in keeping with this kind of formula. The bassoon is the solo voice that represents Sancho, and we have a wonderful bassoonist. I don't know if she's in the room. Her name is Laura. She plays the fast staccato notes, and the bassoon solo is playful and comedic, and it's supposed to make the audience chuckle. You will recognize it in the ear. All of a sudden, the whole band warns us of a threat with a dissonant chord. The sandpaper block represents Sancho's donkey shuffling behind Don Quixote. There's a majestic ride to conquer the windmill giant, and percussion clatters all over the floor, literally, as the Don loses his balance while fighting and falls off his horse. So, listen for that. There's more bassoon, as Sancho resets the Don upon his noble steed. Majestic fanfare again, as there's a second charge at the giant windmills. The band is re-energized again in the battle moments as the original theme is introduced. So then we get a brief interlude of the struggle between Don Quixote's delusions and the real world with some musical cacophony in there. And the sound of windmill sails, which will be simulated by a windmill effect. There's actually an instrument that produces that, so I didn't know this either. This is learning curve for me too. Undaunted, the Don continues his chase. Tired and worn out, he makes a couple more thrusts into the windmills, which knock him off his horse once again. Second time. But our poor disturbed Don thinks he won a victory. And at this point, because we hear the bassoon again, at the end of the movement, we aren't sure whether Sancho helps him back on his horse, or more likely, scurries off in frustration. But this is a really fun movement. So that's the third movement, the scherzo, if you will, of this symphony. And now we have movement 4, which is called the Illumination. So the title of this movement, the Illumination, actually has a twofold meaning, and we're going to explore that. At the end of the novel, spoiler alert if you haven't read it, Don Quixote returns home to La Mancha from all his adventures. One of the things the composer mentioned regarding this was the idea of someone reflecting on their life as they approach the end of it. Don Quixote reflects on what he's been through, having been beaten mentally and physically by a world that no longer recognizes his values. He renounces the code of chivalry, the books he has read and took to be true, and his self-proclaimed title as a knight. But the act of renouncing chivalry restores him to his former sanity, okay? Alonso Quijano the Good dies peacefully in his bed. So the Illumination at first represents the enlightenment that the character experiences from the beginning to the end of the entire story, and the return to a state of sound thinking about the outdated values that he had been chasing in his older years. So on the phone, the composer told us he had originally ended the composition there. He dies, that's it, it's finished. But when he presented this to the concert band in Dania, they said, if you ended here on that sorry note, not only will such a downer of an ending never get played, but it misses the plot. The Spanish philosopher and writer Miguel de Unamuno, who I loved studying, writes that on Don Quixote's deathbed, we see his immortality come to light. Okay. In the eyes of Unamuno, his brand of insanity is actually desirable. It allows us to break free from the crowd and see life in its truest perspective. As Unamuno says, Quixote lost his wits for our sake, for our benefit, so to leave us an eternal example of spiritual sincerity. So the composer addresses Don Quixote's death and gives it due weight, but then includes the idea of a spiritual ascension. The second meaning of the Illumination is that we ourselves, the listeners sharing in the story, are enlightened to the fact that a piece of Don Quixote is forever a part of the human condition. So first he dies, but then he lives. Makes sense. So in the music, the Euphonium Solo represents the character of Don Quixote throughout the symphony, and it enters in a somber mood at this point. The thematic leitmotifs return from the previous three movements as Don Quixote reflects upon his life in his chosen imaginary vocation of knighthood. So we hear a dying man recount his life story. Okay. The flute is fluttering above the Don's theme throughout this movement, which in the second movement was the voice of Dulcinea. The trumpets interject, reminding us of his knightly glory days. And warm music leads to final erratic heartbeats in the timpani as he takes his last breaths. Okay. At this point, the theme and the time signature of the dances in the second movement, the Dulcinea movement, re-enter, but without her voice. There's no flute anymore. So we get the dance time signature, but without her voice. And just as we think everything has come to an actual finish, we get the idea of the Don's ascension. Again, it's majestic and celebratory, building, as the composer says, in glorious fashion, evoking the spirit of Don Quixote of La Mancha in all of humanity. Okay. So this symphony, originally commissioned by a coastal concert band in Spain for the 400th anniversary of the publication of the novel, is now part of concert band repertoire and is performed all over the world. Our band, the Dunedin Concert Band, has worked so hard on this piece, not only for this concert, but they've been working hard in general to be able to bring you symphonic works over the course of the years. At one of the last concerts this year, they played Rachmaninoff. So they've really been working very hard. I hope you enjoy this one as well. I hope this talk has been informative and enjoyable for you all. If you have any specific questions, I know we don't want to go over time because the concert starts at 3, but if you have any specific questions about the context or the characters or the music, how the music relates, you're welcome to come up and ask. But I just thank you for coming and thank you for supporting live music, and I hope you enjoy the concert.